abandoning Iraq, the policy that has been described by President Obama's critics, because that's exactly what took place. Not able to establish the status of forces agreement, putting the poison pill, putting it before Parliament. Bottom line, Bush handed them a victory in Iraq, and President Obama changed the idea from working with the Iraqi government, holding their hand at times, but recognizing that they will be a partner with the United States until they get their feet on the ground. And that does not necessarily mean engaging the troops, but certainly a troop presence that offered influence over Maliki, Prime Minister Maliki. When President Obama made it clear that his plan was to put the pressure on the Iraqis to get things together by walking away, well, he created a vacuum that was once filled by the decision to surge troops in 2007. That was opposed by President Obama and Vice President Biden, then senators. So they oppose the surge. They get in, they're handed a victory, and they turn it into a defeat. And yet, Brian Williams of NBC attempts to, well, roll it.
Fighting forces are gone from Iraq, but as so many predicted when President Bush chose to go to war there after 9/11, the fighting has started up again. We all learned about the city of Fallujah during the war. Well, now there are reports al-Qaeda forces may have seized control of that city while threatening another.
Fallujah, the same city U.S. troops fought and died to control in 2004. 7 years after that battle, the last U.S. combat troops left Iraq.
This is a historic moment. A war is ending. A new day is upon us.
But some warned the U.S. withdrawal left a security vacuum.
So, in order to get history right, not allow the revisionists to come in, because this, in essence, why am I doing this? Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on AFR Talk. Oh, you love Bush. I like President Bush, absolutely. I respect what he did. I disagree with him on some things domestically and amnesty, a whole host of things, quite frankly, domestically. And obviously, with foreign policy, don't agree with him on everything there. I certainly agree with the decision to go into Iraq. I still do believe that was the best decision at the time and was the right thing to do. Nevertheless, when you advance information that is not true contextually, when it comes to war and fighting our enemy, which are Islamic terrorist organizations and nation states, what happens is that has a bill, a bloody bill, because sooner or later that will lead to decisions of putting troops in harm's way or how best to secure a particular situation. And to understand, not to understand that President Obama's approach of hands off, a complete departure from what President Bush handed off to him, caused a vacuum, which has led to the deaths of thousands and will inevitably need to be confronted. And that enemy is going to be a stronger enemy, a more organized enemy, and it will inevitably, heaven forbid, create a greater death toll than if we would have gone forward with what President Bush handed off and that strategy. President Bush, on the 5th anniversary of the Iraq War, gave a speech. I have excerpts of that speech because it details, quite frankly, the truth about what President Bush did. You may agree, you may disagree with his philosophy, but in this speech, he starts talking about how the surge has been working and continues to work. Roll it.
On this anniversary, the American people should know that since the surge began, the level of violence is significantly down. Civilian deaths are down. Sectarian killings are down. Attacks on American forces are down. We have captured or killed thousands of extremists in Iraq, including hundreds of key al-Qaeda leaders and operatives. Our men and women in uniform are performing with characteristic honor and valor. The surge is working. It has opened the door to a major strategic victory in the broader war on terror. For the terrorists, Iraq was supposed to be a place where al-Qaeda rallied Arab masses to drive America out. Instead, Iraq has become the place where Arabs join with Americans to drive al-Qaeda out. Successes we're seeing in Iraq are undeniable, yet some in Washington still call for retreat. War critics can no longer credibly argue that we're losing in Iraq, so they now argue the war costs too much. In recent months, we've heard exaggerated amounts of the costs of this war.
So President Bush then goes on to talk about the costs of disengagement. And he talks about the sacrifice and costs also of the blood of the American soldier. I took excerpts of this speech. The speech is around 6.5 minutes. And so if there are certain parts I have left out, this brings you the basics of what he was talking about, the key messages. And this message is about security, costs, and the price we will all pay if we abandon Iraq. Roll it.
If we were to allow our enemies to prevail in Iraq, the violence that is now declining would accelerate, and Iraq would descend into chaos. Al-Qaeda would regain its lost sanctuaries and establish new ones, fomenting violence and terror that could spread beyond Iraq's borders with serious consequences for the world's economy. Out of such chaos in Iraq, the terrorist movement could emerge emboldened with new recruits, new resources, and an even greater determination to dominate the region and harm America. And emboldened al-Qaeda with access to Iraq's oil resources could pursue its ambitions to acquire weapons of mass destruction to attack America and other free nations.
Then he talked about Iran and the influence and impact they would have, a growing impact they would have if a vacuum was created. Roll it.
Iran would be emboldened as well, with a renewed determination to develop nuclear weapons and impose its brand of hegemony across the Middle East. Our enemies would see an American failure in Iraq as evidence of weakness and a lack of resolve. To allow this to happen would be to ignore the lessons of September the 11th and make it more likely that America would suffer another attack like the one we experienced that day, a day in which 19 armed men with box cutters killed nearly 3,000 people on our soil, a day after which, in the following of that attack, more than 1 million Americans lost work, lost their jobs. The terrorists intend even greater harm to our country. And we have no greater responsibility than to defeat our enemies across the world so that they cannot carry out such an attack.
And the president closed with the message of hope. Roll it.
We will stay on the offense. But in the long run, defeating the terrorists requires an alternative to their murderous ideology. And there we have another advantage. We've got a singular advantage with our military when it comes to finding the terrorists and bringing them to justice. And we have another advantage in our strong belief in the transformative power of liberty. So we're helping the people of Iraq establish a democracy in the heart of the Middle East. A free Iraq will fight terrorists instead of harboring them. A free Iraq will be an example for others of the power of liberty to change the societies and to displace despair with hope. By spreading the hope of liberty in the Middle East, we will help free societies take root. And when they do, freedom will yield the peace that we all desire.
You may disagree with the president's hopeful vision. I can appreciate that because there's a lot more to the background of those words and the impact of those words and the promise of those words. There's a lot of heavy lifting that needs to go on. Nevertheless, the president warned the next elected president about abandoning Iraq. Now you say, Crane, you're accusing President Obama of losing that war. It could have happened anyway. Anything, there are possibilities. But when you create a vacuum, you can count on it being filled. You can count on them being the enemy that we are fighting looks at the issue as Osama bin Laden put it in 1996 in his letter as a strong horse versus the weak horse. And President Bush understood this. President Obama had a very different approach. I read from Iraq's Lessons on Political Will in the Middle East Quarterly, from Middle East Quarterly, Patrick Knapp wrote this. While the Bush administration had prioritized relationships and trust building, the Obama administration sent Prime Minister Maliki the clear message that it wished to keep Iraq's state-building efforts at arm's length. The Obama administration played no active role in conditioning the political will of Maliki and the rest of the Iraq political players and malcontents. As a result, Maliki and his authoritarian tendencies have intensified, and Iranian influence has begun to fill the vacuum left by Washington. And as he cites directly, because that was an agency report, as he cites directly, he says, the Obama administration had a completely different vision. When its predecessor had prioritized relationships and trust building, the new administration sent Maliki a clear message that U.S. domestic political calculus would trump further entanglements with Iraq. U.S. concern would be less with securing fragile political gains on foreign soil than fulfilling political promises to wind down U.S. involvement. This actually is touched on with documentation of requests for troop levels that we see in Mark Thiessen's work over at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, I'm bringing you this because if we don't learn the lesson that the arm's length approach of saying, hey, I can just end a war and there aren't going to be consequences, I can just create a security vacuum and it's not going to be filled by the belligerents and the ones that have the power and the guns, then what we do is increase the death toll of the next time we have to engage the enemy, which inevitably we will because they desire a worldwide caliphate. That's the bottom line. So as we're talking about this and revisionism takes place and no accountability when it comes to President Obama's policies, those policies have a consequence. And it's not only dead Iraqis, it's not only our trust that we have to restore inevitably when people look to us because they're being slaughtered and the enemy's gotten the capability enough to hurt us or Israel or the rest of our allies in some capacity and threaten the world. We can't wish evil away. It is there. We must stop ignoring our Judeo-Christian foundation and saying it's on the same level as other cultures that are based on Islam. Or for that matter, secular humanism. Bottom line, again, evil is not going away. And weakness invites aggression. Joined us. We did an entire segment on Iraq and President Obama's abandoning of Iraq. One thing I want to say is when I'm talking about the death toll, the future death toll of getting history wrong or trying to rewrite it as the left consistently attempts to do. And I gave the example of that through Brian Williams, but also there are a whole host of examples. Remember, it was the left that put our national security on the altar of politics by accusing the president of lying and attempting to undermine our credibility, something our enemies have understood domestically, undermine our credibility, something our enemies have understood, certainly in the sense of Vietnam. Phil Jennings' great book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Vietnam War, details about how North Vietnamese generals have spoken to the idea of saying we would never be able to defeat the United States despite the aid that we are getting from Russia and China. We had to use the American left to our advantage. If you're against the war, if you're for the war, whatever war it may be, I can appreciate your right to do that and articulate your points in that. Good people can disagree on what the threshold is for troops to be in harm's way. I think we would all agree that once they are in harm's way and the choice is to put them there, then we give them a path to victory. We give them rules of engagement that allow them to achieve that victory with the least amount of casualties and wounded. We take care of our troops when they return. 18 to 22% of our budget is dedicated to national security for the military. And as we understand this, I think we need to take that pie chart and look at the 60+% that we cannot sustain through entitlement programs and recognize what our government, our federal government, is tasked with, and that is protecting us. And the people that do that are those in the service of defense as well as state and, most importantly, the armed services, as importantly and certainly heroically are the people that put on the uniform. And so, yeah, if you're going to give anything, always give it to the veterans, period, and make sure they have a path to victory. You can't just end wars. I digress. I'm going to get off topic, and I want to stay on topic. It's a very emotional topic for me because I can't stand the fact that the media is covering for President Obama's failed foreign policy. And it's ending up with more dead Israelis, more dead Americans, more dead Westerners, more dead Muslims who desire to be free. It's very upsetting.